welcome back to Black Indians and Freedmen, the podcast. How are you, Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. All right. Well, Chapter 4 ended with the founding of the Indian Mission Annual Conference. How does Chapter 5 pick up on this narrative?
So, Chapter 5 picks up by talking about the diverse indigenous ministers who expand throughout the Indian Mission Annual Conference and the roles that they play in expanding this conference. So, it's divided into several parts. So, first, I talk about Black Indigenous ministers, I talk about then African American ministers, and then I discuss a white minister, all of whom worked through the Indian Mission Annual Conference, and I kind of detail the different roles they all played.
All right. Well, on page 101, it begins your section entitled Black Indian Ministers. When were Black Indians first appointed to the Indian Mission Annual Conference?
Initially, what becomes the Indian Mission Annual Conference was a part of the Arkansas Annual Conference. So initially, the ministers who came to Indian Territory were African American ministers from Arkansas. And it's not until about 1878 that you start to get Black Indigenous ministers who start pastoring these various churches. And then after that, that pattern continues because the AME Church recognized that, although these people may look, like African Americans, they have a lot of cultural differences, linguistic differences, and we really need to cultivate talent within Black Indigenous communities to pastor churches for Black Indigenous people.
Okay. All right. Well, beginning on page 102, you detail the tension between the Black Creek and African Americans. So, what were the sources of this tension?
It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it was because the ministers who report these tensions don't exactly say what it is. Mm-hmm. But my best guess would be that there are tensions because, again, although they may look similar to African Americans, there are cultural differences. And some of the records indicate that maybe the tensions were caused by some of those differences. Perhaps, Black Creeks were dressing in a way that African Americans were off-put by. Maybe they were speaking the Creek language and some African Americans were confused by that. So we don't get an exact pinpoint of what the issue was, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there was a learning curve dealing with, African American ministers and these Black Creek ministers as well.
Okay. So what roles did the Black Creek ministers Peter Stidham, Robert Grayson, and John A. Broadnax play in early AME expansion into Indian Territory? You discussed these three ministers on pages 101 through 105. Also, what role did they play in their nation's government?
So all of these ministers play important roles in planting churches and pastoring churches already in existence. There was really a lot of interest in the denomination within, the Black Creek community. And so the fact that these, individuals were from those communities, that only, lent credence to their participation. So it really signaled to Black Creek people that the AME Church is, willing to be there for you and interested in your best interests. And so having these ministers who have the cultural fluency to know what Black Creek communities wanted and what they needed, that only enabled them to continue to expand the denomination. So they all play different roles, but generally speaking, they are either planting churches, pastoring churches already in existence. They are going to be founding schools. And so these Black Creek ministers are particularly fervent in their efforts towards planting African Methodism firmly in the Indian Mission Annual Conference.
Okay. All right. So please compare and contrast the contributions of Black Creeks to the Indian Mission Annual Conference relative to other nations of the 5 civilized tribes.
Yeah, and actually linking back to the last part of your question that I forgot that I didn't address in terms of Black Creeks in the Creek Nation's government. So what I see in this period is that yes, there are Black Indigenous ministers represented from the various five civilized tribes, but Black Creek ministers are particularly impactful, and I think that there's a connection between that and the fact that they were able to hold office in the Creek Nation. So they are serving in roles within the Creek government, representing towns like North Fork Colored, etc. And so I think, again, that is part of why you see Black Creek ministers having a particular impact in this period. So there were Black Cherokee ministers, Black Choctaw ministers, and they all play an important role. But we really see in particular the Black Creek ministers playing a significant part in expanding the denomination.
All right. On page 106, you state that by the early 1900s, only a few Black Indian ministers remained in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. To what do you attribute this paucity of Black Indian ministers? Ironically, what was happening to African American representation in the IMAC?
A variety of factors lead to the decrease in Black Indigenous ministers in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. In the case of some, they move away. So John A. Broadnax, for example, moves to Kansas, I believe. Other ministers pass away and they're not replaced. So you do see a decrease in their numbers. And this is also due to the fact that there is increased African American migration into Indian Territory by the time you get to the early 20th century. And so their numbers continue to swell. There have always been African Americans in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, but their numbers just increase in terms of clergy and lay people as you get more and more African Americans migrating from places like Arkansas, Texas, etc. And so that is a trend that probably concerned Black Indigenous people because they certainly wanted to maintain their representation in leadership positions. But the reality is that as African American migration increased, the numbers of Black Indigenous ministers decreased, and those who had been present either moved away, passed away, and they just weren't replaced.
All right. Okay. In your section entitled African American Ministers, beginning on page 107, you talk about Dennis Barrows, Jacob B. Young, and James Fletcher Morris, African American ministers who joined the African Methodist migration to Indian Territory and married into the five civilized tribes. So, what is notable about these marriages, and was this a larger pattern in this time period?
What makes these ministers so interesting really is the fact that they marry Black Indigenous women. And so in this way, they become incorporated into Black Indigenous communities, and they end up fighting, for the rights of Black Indigenous people, not only because it's what they feel led to do, but because they're fighting for their own families. And so this is an important dynamic and helps to explain why you see, in later years and when I get to chapter 7, AME ministers appearing before the Dawes Commission, not only to defend their parishioners, but to defend their own children, because their children who have Black Indigenous mothers, they are entitled to representation within, the tribal nations. And so you see Dennis Barrows show up fighting for citizenship for his own children. And so this dynamic is really important and kind of unique to the AME Church's role in Black Indigenous communities because they become literally a part of these communities. So all of those men do that. And so these are just the 3 examples I was able to find. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more. These were just the ones I was able to document.
All right. How did ministers such as G.A.L. Dykes and A.J. Miller build up the Indian Mission Annual Conference? And you have details about these 2 found on pages 109 to 110.
So G.A.L. Dykes in particular plays an important role just as a pastor in the region, but also he is very much interested in supporting the institutions that the AME Church is establishing in Indian Territory. So he is a big proponent of their educational system and their schools. A.J. Miller, a minister originally from South Carolina, he serves in the Indian Mission Annual Conference for 4 years, and he is very much actively a part of politics in the region and just supporting and defending his parishioners. So both men, both African American ministers, play an important role in these indigenous communities and in bolstering up the institutions, the infrastructure that the AME Church is building in Indian Territory.
Okay. You ready for our quote?
I am.
All right. So please expand upon this quote and provide further context. So on page 111, you wrote of James Fitzallen Sisson, quote, as a white clergyman in the AME Church, he was the living embodiment of the denomination's egalitarian ethos. His willingness to subordinate himself to Black ecclesiastical authority made him unique among white ministers in Indian Territory.
Explain?
Yes, please explain.
Yeah. So James Fitzallen Sisson is one of the most interesting people I found in the course of my research for this book. Sisson is born in Massachusetts. Again, he is a white man born in Massachusetts. And then after the Civil War comes south and he joins the AME Church, becomes an ordained minister in the AME Church. He labors in Virginia. He labors in Georgia. He labors in Arkansas and eventually Indian Territory. And then after that, he ends his ministry in Mississippi. And he is unique, not only because he plays a pioneering role in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. He was actually the one who proposed that the Indian Mission Annual Conference become a separate conference from the Arkansas. And so he is really there at the very beginning. He's there at the establishment of the Indian Mission Annual Conference in 1879 at Annie Keel and Billy Keel's home. He is right there. He is one of the pioneering ministers. And as evidence of that, when the AME Church establishes its flagship school in Indian Territory, it's named after Sisson. It's named the Sisson Industrial Institute. So just as evidence of his importance. What else is really interesting about him is that, you have plenty of white people, white clergymen who are seeking to aid, freedmen, people who had been formerly enslaved. You see many examples of white Northerners coming to the South and assisting freedmen. What you don't see, what I have not seen again, the research may be out there, but I have not seen anyone else, any other white person who joins a Black denomination. And what that means is that he is, as the quote says, subordinating himself to Black ecclesiastical authority. He is placing himself, underneath the Black bishop, who at the time was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He is saying, where Bishop Turner tells me to go, if he assigns me to this place, I will go. What Bishop Turner tells me to do, I will do. That is what it means to be a pastor in this, in the system. So yes, there are plenty of white people who are assisting freedmen in a variety of ways, but Sisson is the only one that I have seen thus far who is willing to go this far, to really practice what he's preaching in saying that African Americans can maintain their own institutions. I, believe in their ability, their leadership ability, their intelligence. And he's not just saying that, he is proving that by joining the denomination and again, subordinating himself to, Bishop Turner and the other, Black bishops. And so that is something that you don't really see white people taking it that far and really living that belief that yes, African Americans can run their own institutions. And I believe it so much, I'm willing to, become a part of it and allow myself to be governed by them.
So to that point, I can imagine how other whites responded. So you
Not
talk
well.
about right. So you talk about Sisson's works and efforts in Maryland and in Georgia, some of which is on page 112. So how did whites respond to Sisson, and what kind of things did Sisson say that made them react how they did? And how were their reactions in line with how they felt about African Methodism as a whole?
Well, Sisson, because of his willingness to not only assist African Americans, which in and of itself was a dangerous prospect in this time period, because, there are countless examples of white vigilantes burning down black churches and black schools. So just helping freedmen at all was dangerous. But for him to take that step further to say, I'm going to be a part of the denomination, I'm going to, accept my lower rung in this hierarchy, that made some people just apoplectic. And he is a victim of vigilante violence on multiple occasions. There's one occasion where he's, talking about how much he, admires the AME Church, how they have their own newspaper, they have their own institutions of higher education, how they have all these churches. They've been an autonomous black denomination since the beginning. And some whites who hear this are so mad, they threaten to, really attack him and kill him. And he is run out of several states. Things get so bad when he's in Georgia that he appeals to the president, who at this time is Ulysses S. Grant. So this was in 1872, that he is, working in Georgia, and he is, run out of town, essentially. If you don't get out of here, we're going to kill you. And so he appeals to Ulysses S. Grant. It's not clear what Grant said, but whatever he said or didn't say, it wasn't sufficient, because Sisson, runs for his life out of Georgia and goes to Arkansas, and then from Arkansas to Indian Territory. And there's one occasion where someone had shot up his house, and he, took the bullets out of the wall and brought them to an AME annual conference to show them as proof of, what was happening to him. So this was, a very dangerous thing for him to do. He was very literally putting his life on the line. And so that, again, is what makes him unique. There are plenty of whites who are assisting black people and putting their lives on the line. But I feel that Sisson is taking it to another level. And it's just very, very interesting. And it really shows how deeply he believed in African Americans and their ability to govern themselves, that he was willing to, risk his own life in this crucial way.
I don't mean to go off script, but was it hard to find research on Sisson, and what were your sources for all these anecdotes?
Well, everything wasn't all in one place, so I could get a piece here, a piece there. And, when I actually think about it, I had seen his name before, but it doesn't always say in the records that he was a white man and did such and such. Mm-hmm. So any of us may have read his name and just not made the connection. Mm-hmm. So he shows up all the time in AME records. He shows up in annual conference minutes. He shows up in general conference minutes, because he's often, a delegate representing, whatever conference he's in. And his family is fairly well known in Fall River, Massachusetts, I believe. So I found information on his family. It was hard to find information about his early life before he joined the AME Church. But after that, there's a lot. I mean, the Christian Recorder has numerous letters that he wrote. So he publishes letters all throughout his ministry that appear in the Christian Recorder. So he writes about, yes, I just arrived in Indian Territory. My mailing address is in the Choctaw Nation. If you want to contact me, see me here. This is who I met. This is what we're doing. This is the church we established. And so he does appear a lot in AME records. So there actually is a good bit about him, but again, not all in one place.
Interesting. All right, shifting gears a little bit. How was the Indian Mission Annual Conference thriving financially And how did the IMAC ministers support each other to combat any difficulties they or the conference faced? You begin talking about this in your section entitled Diverse Ministers United in Ministry on page 115.
The Indian Mission Annual Conference, certainly in those early years, was struggling financially. Keep in mind that most of the membership, these are formerly enslaved people who are barely making it themselves. So they don't have a whole lot of income to pay their pastor. They do the best they can. They'll let the pastor, stay in their house. They'll, make food for him if they can, but they don't just have lots and lots of money to support a pastor. And as a result, it's very challenging for ministers who go out there and they have, very poor parishioners. And this isn't a unique situation to Indian Territory. This would be the case in any region where most of the membership are poor, formerly enslaved people. And so, Indian Territory is just one example of that. And, things get better over time, but it is challenging. It's also especially challenging because of the expectations for travel. So as you know, the AME Church has a very full calendar. You have, district conference meetings, you have annual conference meetings, you have general conference meetings. So you could be traveling, hundreds of miles, every, few months. And, at one point, Sisson, for example, is a presiding elder, which means that he has to oversee several churches and make sure everything is running smoothly. So he is having to travel to multiple places, again, hundreds of miles. And, if your horse gets sick, how do you get there? And so in that section that you referenced in the book, I'm just talking about some of those difficulties and how ministers would try to help each other. They would try to travel together. And if, again, someone's horse died, they would try to work together to find a solution because they're all kind of out there without a whole lot of financial support. But they, persevere and keep going. And it is, indicative of how seriously they took this ministry that, I'm not in it to, become a wealthy person. I'm here because I take it seriously. And this is what I want to be doing with my life. Because there were, I'm sure, much less strenuous and dangerous jobs at the time. But this was, clearly something these people really wanted to be doing because it was challenging.
All right. Well, to put a bow on this chapter, overall, how significant were racial and ethnic inclusivity as facets of the AME Church?
Really, the argument of the book overall is that when Richard Allen establishes the AME Church, he's doing so with the intention of making it an inclusive denomination. And I talked, about that in our first episode. And these ministers in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, they perfectly encapsulate that vision. You have Black Indigenous people from the various tribal nations. You have African Americans from all over the South coming to Indian Territory and ministering in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. You have Sisson, a white man who is, an important part, really a pioneering figure in the establishment of this conference. And so that is the mission that I argue is really what Allen was striving for. He wanted this to be a denomination that really welcomed anyone. He was clear about, that being the purpose. And these ministers, these diverse ministers in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, they really demonstrate that, just looking at them. If you were to, if we had a camera, we could go back in time and we were just to take a snapshot of an annual conference meeting, in 1883 in Indian Territory, you would see, this diverse array of people. You would see them dressed differently. You would perhaps hear them speaking different languages. And it just really is, in my view, what Allen really intended.
Well said. All right. Well, that does wrap up chapter 5. Thank you. And I know I look forward to reading chapter 6.
Thank you so much. I look forward to chatting about it.